Chapter 12. Might I Have a Bit of Earth? Mary ran so fast that she was rather out of breath when she reached her room. Her hair was ruffled on her forehead, and her cheeks were bright pink. Her dinner was waiting on the table, and Martha was waiting near it. "That's a bit late," she said. "Where's the bin?" "I've seen Dickon," said Mary. "I've seen Dickon." "I knew he'd come," said Martha exultantly. "How does thee like him?" I think he's beautiful," said Mary in a determined voice. Martha looked rather taken aback, but she looked pleased too. "Well," she said, "he's the best lad as ever was born, but I never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much." "I like it to turn up," said Mary. "And his eye is so round," said Martha, a trifle doubtful, "though they're a nice color." "I like them round," said Mary, "and they are exactly the color of the sky over the moor." Martha beamed with satisfaction. "Mother says he made 'em that color with always looking up at the birds and the clouds, but he was got a big mouth, hasn't he now?" "I love his big mouth," said Mary obstinately. "I wish mine were just like it." This chapter's starting really awkward. Not gonna lie. Martha chuckled delightedly. "It'd look rare and funny in thy bit of a face," she said, "but I know it'd be that way when thou saw him. How do thou like the seeds and the garden tools?" "How did you know he brought them?" asked Mary. "I never thought of him not bringing 'em. He'd be sure to bring 'em if they was in Yorkshire. He's such a trusty lad." Mary was afraid that she might begin to ask difficult questions, but she did not. She was very much interested in the seeds and gardening tools, and there was only one moment when Mary was frightened. This was when she began to ask where the flowers were to be planted. "Who did they ask about it?" she inquired. "I haven't asked anybody yet," said Mary, hesitating. "Well, I wouldn't ask the head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is." "I've never seen him," said Mary. "I've only seen under gardeners and Ben Weatherstaff." "If I was you, I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff," advised Martha. He's not half as bad as he looks, for all he's so crabbed. Mr. Craven lets him do what he likes because he was here when Mrs. Craven was alive, and he used to make her laugh. She liked him. Perhaps he'd find you a corner somewhere out of the way." "If it was out of the way and no one wanted it, no one could mind me having it, could they?" Mary said anxiously. "There wouldn't be no reason," answered Martha. "You wouldn't do no harm." Mary ate her dinner as quickly as she could, and when she rose from the table she was going to run to her room and put on her hat again, but Martha stopped her. "I've got something to tell you," she said. "I thought I'd let you eat your dinner first. Mr. Craven came back this morning, and I think he wants to see you." Mary turned quite pale. "Oh," she said. "Why?" "Why, he didn't want to see me when I came. I heard Pitcher say he didn't." "Well," explained Martha, "Mrs. Medlock says it's because of Mother. She was walking in Thwaite Village and she met him. She'd never spoke to him before, but Mrs. Craven had been to our cottage 2 or 3 times. He'd forgot, but Mother hadn't. She made bold to stop him. I don't know what she said to him about you, but she said something has put him in the mind to see you before he goes away again tomorrow." "Oh," cried Mary, "is he going away tomorrow? I'm so glad." "He's going for a long time. He mightn't come back till autumn or winter. He's going to travel in foreign places. He's always doing it." "Oh, I'm so glad, said Mary thankfully. If he did not come back until winter or even autumn, there would be time to watch the secret garden come alive. Even if he found out then and took it away from her, she would have had that much at least. "When do you think you'll want to see—" She did not finish the sentence because the door opened and Mrs. Medlock walked in. She had on her best black dress and cap, and her collar was fastened with a large brooch with a picture of a man's face on it. It was a colored photograph of Mr. Medlock, who had died years ago, and she always wore it when she was dressed up. She looked nervous and excited. "Your hair's rough," she said quickly. "Go and brush it, Martha. Martha, help her to slip on her best dress. Mr. Craven sent me to bring her to him in his study." All the pink left Mary's cheeks. Her heart began to thump, and she felt herself changing into a stiff, plain, silent child again. She did not even answer Mrs. Medlock, but turned and walked into her bedroom, followed by Martha. She said nothing while her dress was changed and her hair brushed, and after she was quite tidy, she followed Mrs. Medlock down the corridor in silence. What was there for her to say? She was obliged to go and see Mr. Craven, and he would not like her, and she would not like him. She knew what he would think of her. She was taken to a part of the house she had not been into before. At last Mrs. Medlock knocked at a door, and when someone said, "Come in," they entered the room together. A man was sitting in an armchair before the fire, and Mrs. Medlock spoke to him. "This is Miss Mary, sir," she said. "You can go and leave her here. I will ring for you when I want you to take her away," said Mr. Craven. When she went out and closed the door, Mary could only stand waiting, a plain little thing, twisting her thin hands together. She could see that the man in the chair was not so much a hunchback as a man with a high, rather crooked shoulder, and he had black hair streaked with white. He turned his head over his high shoulders and spoke to her. "Come here," he said. Mary went to him. He was not ugly. His face would have been handsome if it had not been so miserable. He looked as if the sight of her worried and fretted him, and as if he did not know what in the world to do with her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," answered Mary. "Do they take good care of you?" "Yes." He rubbed his forehead fretfully as he looked her over. "You are very thin," he said. "I'm getting fatter," Mary answered in what she knew was her stiffest way. What an unhappy face he had! His black eyes seemed as if they scarcely saw her, as if they were seeing something else, and he could hardly keep his thoughts upon her. "I forgot you," he said. "How could I remember you? I intended to send you a governess or a nurse or something of that sort, but I forgot." "Please," began Mary, "please." And then the lump in her throat choked her. "What do you want to say?" he inquired. I'm too big for a nurse," said Mary. "And please don't make me have a governess yet." He rubbed his forehead again and stared at her. "That was what the Sowerby woman said," he muttered absent-mindedly. Then Mary gathered a scrap of courage. Is she Martha's mother?" she stammered. "Yes, I think so," he replied. "She knows about children," said Mary. "She has 12. She knows." He seemed to rouse himself. "What do you want to do?" "I want to play outdoors," Mary answered, hoping that her voice did not tremble. "I never liked it in India. It makes me hungry here. And I'm getting fatter." He was watching her. "Mrs. Sowerby said it would do you good. Perhaps it will," he said. "She thought you had better get stronger before you had a governess." "It makes me feel strong when I play and the wind comes over the moor," argued Mary. "Where do you play?" he asked next. "Everywhere," gasped Mary. "Martha's mother sent me a skipping rope, and I skip and run, and I look about to see if things are beginning to stick up out of the earth. I don't do any harm." "Don't look so frightened," he said in a worried voice. "You could do no harm. You could not do any harm. A child like you may do what you like." Mary put her hand up to her throat because she was afraid he might see the excited lump which she felt jump into it. She came a step nearer to him. "May I?" she said tremulously. Her anxious little face seemed to worry him more than ever. "Don't look so frightened," he exclaimed. "Of course you may. I am your guardian, though I am a poor one for any child. I cannot give you time or attention. I am too ill and wretched and distracted. But I wish you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Mrs. Medlock is to see that you have all you need. I sent for you today because Mrs. Sowerby said I ought to see you. Her daughter had talked about you. She thought you needed fresh air and freedom and running about." "She knows all about children," Mary said, again in spite of herself. "She ought to," said Mr. Craven. "I thought her rather bold to stop me on the moor, but she said Mrs. Craven had been kind to her." It seemed hard for him to speak of his dead wife's name. "She's a respectable woman. Now I have seen you. I think she said sensible things. Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place, and you may go where you like and amuse yourself as you like. Is there anything you want?" As if a sudden thought had struck him. "Do you want toys, books, dolls?" "Might I," quavered Mary, "might I have a bit of earth?" In her eagerness she did not realize how queer the words would sound and that they were not the ones she had meant to say. Mr. Craven looked quite startled. "Earth?" he repeated. "What do you mean?" "To plant seeds in, to make things grow, to see them come alive," Mary faltered. He gazed at her a moment and then passed his hands quickly over his eyes. "Do you care about gardens so much?" he said slowly. "I didn't know about them in India," said Mary. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. I sometimes made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them, but here it is different." "A bit of earth," he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his dark eyes looked almost soft and kind. "You can have as much earth as you want," he said. "You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want," with something like a smile, "take it, child, and make it come alive." "May I take it from anywhere, if it's not wanted?" "Anywhere," he answered. "There, you must go now. I'm tired." He touched the bell to call Mrs. Medlock. "Good-bye. I shall be away all summer." Mrs. Medlock came so quickly that Mary thought she must have been waiting in the corridor. "Mrs. Medlock," Mr. Craven said to her, "now I have seen the child, I understand what Mrs. Sowerby meant. She must be less delicate before she begins lessons. Give her simple, healthy food. Let her run wild in the garden. Don't look after her too much. She needs liberty and fresh air and romping about. Mrs. Sowerby is to come and see her now and then, and she may sometimes go to the cottage." Mrs. Medlock looked pleased. She was relieved to hear that she need not look after Mary too much. She had felt her a tiresome charge, and had indeed seen as little of her as she dared. In addition to this, she was fond of Martha's mother. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Susan Sowerby and me went to school together, and she's as sensible and good-hearted a woman as you find in a day's walk. I never had any children myself, and she's had 12, and there never was healthier or better ones. Mrs. Mary can get no harm from them. I'd always take Susan Sowerby's advice about children myself. She's what you might call healthy-minded, if you understand me." "I understand," Mr. Craven answered. "Take Mrs. Mary away now, and send Pitcher to me." When Mrs. Medlock left her at the end of her own corridor, Mary flew back to her room. She found Martha waiting there. Martha had, in fact, hurried back after she had removed the dinner service. "I can have my garden," cried Mary. "I may have it where I like. I'm not going to have a governess for a long time. Your mother is coming to see me, and I may come to your cottage. He says a little girl like me could not do any harm, and I may do what I like anywhere." "Yes," said Martha delightedly. "That was a nice hymn, wasn't it?" "Martha," said Mary solemnly, He is a really nice man, only his face is so miserable and his forehead is all drawn together." She ran as quickly as she could to the garden. She had been away so much longer than she had thought she should, and she knew Dickon would have to set out early on his 5-mile walk. When she slipped through the door under the ivy, she saw he was not working where she had left him. The garden tools were laid together under a tree. She ran to them, looking all around the place, but there was no Dickon to be seen. He had gone away, and the secret garden was empty, except for the robin, who had just flown across the wall and sat in a standard rose bush watching her. "He's gone," she said woefully. "Oh, was he only a wood fairy?" Something white fastened to the standard rose bush caught her eye. It was a piece of paper. In fact, it was a piece of the letter she had printed for Martha to send to Dickon. It was fastened on the bush with a long thorn, and in a minute she knew Dickon had left it there. There were some roughly printed letters on it and a sort of picture. At first she could not tell what it was. Then she saw it was meant for a nest with a bird sitting on it. Underneath were the printed letter, and they said, "I will come back." Okay, I'm going to be skipping the usual analyses for this book. On account of its rather gentle pacing, it doesn't really have any fast turns to discuss. The meeting with Mr. Craven was somewhat interesting. I was expecting it to be more of a setback scene where all of her plans get pulled out from under her. I was expecting, a governess to come and be very strict and controlling, and she'd have to find some way to sneak back to the garden. But it was really just two socially awkward people socially awkwarding at each other, which is, kind of relaxing and fun to read. I liked it. Until next time, I'm Annie Johnson, signing off. Welcome back to The Secret Garden. This time I have actually managed to comb my hair, which in 2020 is quite an achievement, and I am celebrating. We'll be reading what I believe is Chapter 13 of The Secret Garden. I am Colin. Mary took the picture back to the house when she went to her supper, and she showed it to Martha. "Yes," said Martha with a great pride. "I never knew our Dickon was as clever as that. That there's a picture of a missel thrush on her nest, as large as life and twice as natural." When Mary knew Dickon had meant the picture to be a message, he had meant that she might be sure he would keep her secret. Her garden was her nest, and she was like a missel thrush. Oh, how she did like that queer common boy. I like how Mary is just subtly insulting without meaning to be. It reminds me of myself. She hoped he would come back the very next day, and she fell asleep looking forward to the morning. But you never know what the weather will do in Yorkshire, particularly in the springtime. She was awakened in the night by the sound of rain beating with heavy drops against her window. It was pouring down in torrents, and the wind was wuthering around the corners and in the chimneys of the huge old house. Mary sat up in bed and felt miserable and angry. "The rain is as contrary as I ever was," she said. "It came because it knew I did not want it to." She threw herself back on her pillow and buried her face. She did not cry, but she lay and hated the sound of the heavily beating rain. She hated the wind and its wuthering. She could not go to sleep again. The mournful sound kept her awake because she felt mournful herself. If she had felt happy, it would probably have lulled her to sleep. How it withered and how big raindrops poured down and beat against the pane. "It sounds just like a person lost on the moor, wandering on and crying," she said. She had been lying awake, turning from side to side for about an hour, when suddenly something made her sit up in bed and turn her head towards the door, listening. She listened and listened. "It isn't the wind now," she said in a loud whisper. "That isn't the wind. It is different. It is that crying I heard before." The door of her room was ajar, and the sound came down the corridor, a far-off, faint sound of fretful crying. She listened for a few minutes, and each minute she became more and more sure. She felt as if she must find out what it was. It seemed even stranger than the secret garden and the buried key. Perhaps the fact that she was in a rebellious mood made her bold. She put her foot out of bed and stood on the floor. "I'm going to find out what it is," she said. "Everybody is in bed, and I don't care about Mrs. Medlock. I don't care." There was a candle by her bedside, and she took it up and went softly out of the room. The corridor looked very long and dark, but she was too excited to mind that. She thought she remembered the corners she must turn to find the short corridor with the door covered with a tapestry, the one Mrs. Medlock had come through the day she had lost herself. The sound had come up that passage, so she went on with their dim light, almost feeling her way. Her heart beating so loud that she fancied she could hear it. The far-off faint crying went on and led her. Sometimes it stopped for a moment or so and then began again. Was this the right corner to turn? She stopped and thought. Yes, it was. Down this passage and then to the left, and then up 2 broad steps and then to the right again. Yes, there was the tapestry door. She pushed it open very gently and closed it behind her, and she stood in the corridor and could hear the crying quite plainly, though it was not loud. It was on the other side of the wall at her left, and a few yards farther on there was a door. She could see a glimmer of light coming from beneath it. The someone was crying in that room, and it was quite young someone. So she walked to the door and pushed it open. There she was standing in the room. It was a big room with ancient, handsome furniture in it. There was a low fire glowing faintly on the hearth, and at night light burning by the side of a carved 4-posted bed hung with brocade, and on the bed was lying a boy, crying fretfully. Mary wondered if she was in a real place or if she had fallen asleep again and was dreaming without knowing it. The boy had a sharp, delicate face, the color of ivory, and he seemed to have eyes too big for it. He had also a lot of hair which tumbled over his forehead in heavy locks and made his thin face seem smaller. He looked like a boy who had been ill, but he was crying more as if he were tired and crossed, and then as if he were in pain. Mary stood near the door with her candle in her hand, holding her breath. Then she crept across the room, and as she drew nearer, the light attracted the boy's attention, and he turned his head on his pillow and stared at her, his gray eyes opening so wide that they seemed immense. "Who are you?" he said at last in half-frightened whisper. "Are you a ghost?" She should totally say yes. "No, I'm not," Mary answered. Her own whisper sounded half-frightened. "Are you?" He stared and stared and stared. Mary could not help noticing what strange eyes he had. They were agate gray, and they looked too big for his face because they had black lashes all around them. "No," he replied after a moment or so. "I'm Colin." "Who is Colin?" she faltered. "I'm Colin Craven. Who are you?" "I'm Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven is my uncle." "He is my father," said the boy. "Your father?" gasped Mary. "No one told me he had a boy. Why didn't they?" "Come here," he said, and still keeping his strange eyes fixed on her with anxious expression. She came close to the bed, and he put out his hand and touched her. "You are real, aren't you?" he said. "I have such real dreams very often. You might be one of them." Mary had slipped on a woolen wrapper before she left her room, and she put a piece of it between his fingers. "Rub that and see how thick and warm it is," she said. "I'll pinch you a little if you like to show you how real I am. For a minute I thought you might be a dream too." "Where did you come from?" he asked. "From my own room. The wind wuthered so I couldn't go to sleep, and I heard someone crying and wanted to find out who it was." "What were you crying for?" 'Cause I couldn't go to sleep either, and my head ached. Tell me your name again. Mary Lennox. Did no one ever tell you I had come to live here? He was still fingering the fold of her wrapper, but he began to look more as if he believed in her reality. No, he answered, they daren't. Why? Asked Mary. 'Cause I should have been afraid you would see me. I won't let people see me and talk me over. Why? Asked Mary again, feeling more mystified every moment. Because I'm like this always, ill and having to lie down. My father won't let people talk me over either. The servants are not allowed to speak about me. If I live, I may be a hunchback, but I shan't live. My father hates to think I may be like him. Oh, what a queer house this is, Mary said. What a queer house. Everything is a kind of secret. Rooms are locked up and gardens are locked up, and have you been locked up? No, I stay in this room because I don't want to be moved out of it. It tires me too much. Does your father come and see you? Mary ventured. Sometimes, generally when I'm asleep. He doesn't want to see me. Why? Mary could not help asking again. A sort of angry shadow passed over the boy's face. My mother died when I was born, and it makes him wretched to look at me. He thinks I don't know, but I have heard people talk. He always hates me. He hates the garden because she died, Mary half speaking to herself. What garden? Oh, just a garden she used to like, Mary stammered. Have you been here always? Nearly always. Sometimes I've been taken to places at the seaside, but I won't stay because people stare at me. I used to wear an iron thing to keep my back straight, but a grand doctor came from London to see me and said it was stupid. He told them to take it off and keep me out of the fresh air. I hate fresh air and I don't want to go out. I didn't when I first came here. Why do you keep looking at me like that? 'Cause of the dreams that are so real, he answered rather fretfully. Sometimes when I open my eyes, I don't believe I'm awake. We're both awake, said Mary. She glanced around the room with its high ceiling and shadowy corners and dim firelight. It looks quite like a dream, and it's the middle of the night. Everybody in the house is asleep, everybody but us. We are wide awake. I don't want it to be a dream, the boy said restlessly. Mary thought of something all at once. If you don't like people to see you, she began, do you want me to go away? He still held the fold of her wrapper, and he gave it a little pull. No, he said, I should be sure you were a dream if you went. If you were real, sit down on that big footstool and talk. I want to hear about you. Mary put down her candle on the table near the bed and sat down on the cushioned stool. She did not want to go away at all. She wanted to stay in the mysterious hidden-away room and talk to the mysterious boy. What do you want me to tell you? She said. He wanted to know how long she had been at Misselthwaite. He wanted to know which corridor her room was on. He wanted to know what she had been doing, if she disliked the moor as he disliked it, where she had lived before she came to Yorkshire. She answered all these questions and many more, and he lay back on his pillow and listened. He made her tell him a great deal about India and about her voyage across the ocean. She found out that because he had been an invalid, he had not learned things as other children had. One of his nurses had taught him to read when he was quite a little, and he was always reading and looking at pictures in splendid books. Though his father rarely saw him awake when he was awake, he was given all sorts of wonderful things to amuse himself with. He never seemed to have been amused, however. He could have anything he asked for, and was never made to do anything he did not like to do. Everyone is obliged to do what pleases me, he said indifferently. It makes me ill to be angry. No one believes I shall live to grow up. He said it as if he was accustomed to the idea that it had ceased to matter to him at all. He seemed to like the sound of Mary's voice. As she went on talking, he listened in a drowsy, interested way. Once or twice she wondered if he were not gradually falling into a doze, but at last he asked a question which opened up a new subject. How old are you? He asked. I'm 10, answered Mary, forgetting herself for a moment. So are you. How do you know that? He demanded in surprised voice. Because when you were born, the garden door was locked and the key was buried, and has been locked for 10 years. Colin half sat up, turning toward her, leaning on his elbows. What garden door was locked? Who did it? Where was the key buried? He exclaimed as if he were suddenly very much interested. It was the garden Mr. Craven hates, said Mary, nervously. He locked the door. No one knew where he buried the key. What sort of a garden is it? Colin persisted eagerly. No one has been allowed to go into it for 10 years, was Mary's careful answer. But it was too late to be careful. He was too much like herself. He, too, had had nothing to think about, and the idea of a hidden garden attracted him as it had attracted her. He asked question after question. Where was it? Had she never looked for the door? Had she never asked the gardeners? They won't talk about it. I think they've been told not to answer questions. I would make them, said Colin. Could you? Mary faltered, beginning to feel frightened, as if he could make people answer questions. Who knew what might happen? Everyone is obliged to please me. I told you that, he said. If I were to live, this place would sometime belong to me. They all know that. I would make them all tell me. Mary had not known that she herself had been spoiled, but she could see quite plainly that this mysterious boy had been. He thought that the whole world belonged to him, how peculiar he was, and how cruelly he spoke of not living. Do you think you won't live? He asked, partly because she was curious and partly in hope of making him forget the garden. I don't suppose I shall, he answered it as indifferently as he had spoken before. Ever since I remembered anything, I had heard people say I don't. At first they thought it was too little to understand, and now they think I don't hear. But I do. My doctor is my father's cousin. He's quite poor, and if I die, he will have all Misselthwaite when my father is dead. I should think he wouldn't want me to live. Do you want to live? Inquired Mary. No, he answered in a cross, tired fashion, but I don't want to die. When I feel ill, I lie here and think about it till I cry and cry. That's the mood of 2020 right there. I've heard you crying 3 times, Mary said, but I did not know who it was. Were you crying about that? She did so want him to forget the garden. I dare say, he answered. Let us talk about something else. Talk about the garden. Don't you want to see it? Yes, answered Mary in a quite low voice. I do, he went on persistently. I don't think I ever really wanted to see anything before. But I want to see that garden. I want the key dug up. I want the door unlocked. I would let them take me there in my chair. That would be getting fresh air. I'm going to make them open the door. He had become quite excited, and his strange eyes began to shine like stars, and looked more immense than ever. They have to please me, he said. I'll make them take me there, and I will let you go too. Mary's hands clutched each other. Everything would be spoiled, everything. Dickon would never come back. She'd never again feel like a missel thrush with a safe hidden nest. Oh, don't do that, she cried out. He stared at as if he thought she had gone crazy. Why, he exclaimed, you said you wanted to see it. I do, she answered almost with a sob in her throat. But if you make them open the door and take you like that, it will never be a secret again. He leaned still farther forward. A secret, he said. What do you mean? Tell me. Mary's words almost tumbled over one another. You see, she panted, if no one knows but ourselves, if there was a door hidden somewhere under the ivy, if there was, we could find it, and we could slip through it together and shut it behind us, and no one knew anyone was inside, and we called in our garden, pretended that we were missel thrushes and it was our nest, and if we played there almost every day and dug planted seeds and made it all come alive. Is it dead? Interrupted her. It soon will be if no one cares for it, she went on. The bulbs will live, but the roses... He stopped her again, as excited as she was herself. What are bulbs? He put in quickly. They're daffodils and lilies and snowdrops. They're working in the earth now, pushing up pale green points because the spring is coming. Is the spring coming? He said. What is it like? You don't see it in rooms if you're ill. It is the sun shining on the rain, and the rain falling on the sunshine, and things pushing up and working under the earth, said Mary. If the garden was a secret and we could get into it, we could watch things grow bigger every day and see how many roses are alive. Don't you see? Or don't you see how much nicer it would be if it was a secret? He dropped back on his pillow and lay there with an odd expression on his face. I never had a secret, he said, except that one about not living to grow up. They don't know I know that. So it is sort of a secret. But I like this kind better. If you won't make them take you to the garden, pleaded Mary, perhaps I feel almost sure I can find out how to get in sometime, and then if the doctor wants you to go out in your chair, and if you can always do what you want to do, perhaps we might find some boy who would push you, and we could go alone, and we could always be a secret garden. I should like that, he said very slowly, his eyes looking dreamy. I should like that. I should not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Mary began to recover her breath and feel safer because the idea of keeping the secret seemed to please him. She felt almost sure that if she kept on talking and could make him see the garden in his mind as she had seen it, he would like it so much that he would never bear to think that everybody might tromp on it when they chose. I'll tell you what I think it would be like if we could go into it, she said. It has been shut up so long things have grown into a tangle, perhaps. He lay quite still, listening, while she went on talking about the roses, which might have clambered from tree to tree and hung down, about the many birds which might have built their nests there because it was so safe, And then she told him about the robin and Ben Weatherstaff, and there was so much to tell about the robin, and it was so easy and safe to talk about it that she ceased to be afraid. The robin pleased him so much that he smiled until he looked almost beautiful, and at first Mary had thought that he was even plainer than herself, with his big eyes and heavy locks of hair. "I did not know birds could be like that," he said. "But if you stay in a room, you never see things. What a lot of things you know. I feel as if you had been inside that garden." She did not know what to say, so she did not say anything. He evidently did not expect an answer, and the next moment he gave her a surprise. "I'm going to let you look at something," he said. "Do you see that rose-colored silk curtain hanging on the wall over the mantelpiece?" Mary had not noticed it before, but she looked up and saw it. It was a curtain of soft silk hanging over what seemed to be some picture. "Yes," she answered. "There's a cord hanging from it. Go and pull it." Mary got up, much mystified, and found the cord. When she pulled it, the silk curtain ran back on rings, and when it ran back, it uncovered a picture. It was the picture of a girl with a laughing face. She had bright hair tied up with blue ribbon, and her gay, lovely eyes were exactly like Colin's unhappy ones. Agate gray and looking twice as big as they really were because of the black lashes all around them. "She is my mother," said Colin complainingly. "I don't see why she died. Sometimes I hate her for doing it." "How queer," said Mary. "If she had lived, I believe I should not have been ill always," he grumbled. "I dare say I should have lived too. My father would not have hated to look at her. I dare say I should have had a strong back. Draw the curtains again." Mary did as she was told and returned to her footstool. "She is much prettier than you," she said, "but her eyes are just like yours. At least they were the same shape and color. Why is the curtain drawn over her?" He moved uncomfortably. "I made them do it," he said. "Sometimes I don't like to see her looking at me. She smiles too much when I'm ill and miserable. Besides, she is mine, and I don't want everyone to see her." There were a few moments of silence, and then Mary spoke. "What would Mrs. Medlock do if she found out that I had been here?" she inquired. "She would do as I told her to do," he answered, "and I should tell her that I want you to come here and talk to me every day. I'm glad you came." "So am I," said Mary. "I will come as often as I can, but—" she hesitated. "I shall have to look every day for the garden door." "Yes, you must," said Colin, "and you can tell me about it afterwards." He lay thinking a few minutes, as he had done before, and then he spoke again. "I think you shall be a secret too," he said. "I will not tell them until they find out. I can always send the nurse out of the room and say that I want to be by myself. Do you know Martha?" "Yes, I know her very well," said Mary. "She waits on me." He nodded his head towards the outer corridor. "She is the one who is asleep in the other room. The nurse went away yesterday to stay all night with her sister, and she always makes Martha attend to me when she wants to go out. Martha shall tell you when to come here." Then Mary understood Martha's troubled look when she had asked questions about the crying. "Martha knew about you all the time?" she said. "Yes, she often attends to me. The nurse likes to get away from me, and then Martha comes." "You've been here a long time," said Mary. "Shall I go away now? Your eyes look sleepy." "I wish I could go to sleep before you leave me," he said, rather shyly. "Shut your eyes," said Mary, drawing her footstool closer, "and I'll do what my ayah used to do in India. I'll pat your hand and stroke it and sing something quite low." "I should like that, perhaps," he said drowsily. Somehow she was sorry for him and did not want him to lie awake, so she leaned against the bed and began to stroke and pat his hand and sing a very low little chanting song in Hindustani. "That is nice," he said, more drowsily still, and she went on chanting and stroking, but when she looked at him again his black lashes were lying close against his cheeks, for his eyes were shut and he was fast asleep. So she got up softly, took her candle, and crept away without making a sound. So my one comment of analysis here is that in the last chapter, I was talking about how the meeting with Mr. Craven felt like it was going to be an obstacle or a turning point that complicated Mary's life, and it turned out not to be. But this chapter, though it's not telegraphing that, I suspect probably will be much more of a complication in Mary's life. It's actually kind of an interesting pacing technique that they hinted at a problem that didn't develop and then are now introducing a problem, but very slowly. I will have to think more about this and how I can use pacing like this for my own writing. This is Annie Johnson signing off. Blah, 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 like button, comment, blah, 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 blah.